In this video, we're breaking down one of the biggest misconceptions in religious history. That is the idea that God and the Creator are one and the same. From religion to metaphysics, from the original meaning of the word God in antiquity to its modern day misuse in most world belief systems. Most people casually swap these two titles without realizing that they were never originally meant to be used interchangeably. Now, if that made you say, aha, then just wait until you find out the hidden church history that reveals how and why we use them interchangeably today. So get ready to challenge your beliefs and discover why God and the Creator hold different meanings, roles, and purposes in various religions and philosophical traditions. This isn't just about semantics. It's about unlocking a deeper truth about the mechanisms and forces that's shaping our lives. This is a video that you can't afford to skip, so stay tuned because the truth might not be what you think. Most people have been taught to use the words God and Creator interchangeably as if they were synonyms. This is a mistake inherited from our religious traditions. World religions, especially the Abrahamic faiths, are primarily responsible for this error, as they attribute the act of creation to specific gods. These religions portray a humanized figure, so-called God, hovering in darkness and creating the universe out of nothing. In doing so, God is equated with the Creator. This conflation is a theological mistake rooted in the doctrines of organized religion. Before the rise of these world religions, humanity had a very different understanding of creation. Instead of attributing the act of creation to a specific God, it was simply attributed to the Creator. Before the worldwide religious indoctrination of the masses, there was no concept of so-called God, at least not in the way the term is used today. Before we move any further, it's important to note that in ancient times, no so-called gods existed prior to the Creator, because the Creator is the origin of all things, including the gods. So all gods exist within the creation, and the Creator is responsible for that creation, which includes the gods. When the church attributes the act of creation to specific gods, the question arises, who created the God or the gods? The church then responds that God is self-created, essentially popping into existence out of nowhere to create the universe. This problem doesn't arise in ancient thought, since the concept of the Creator never leads to such a question. If someone asks what created the Creator, the answer is simple. The creation created the Creator, and the Creator created the creation. This is because one cannot hold the title of Creator without creating something. At the moment of creation, the Creator is revealed, just as a mother cannot be called a mother without having a child. In this sense, the child creates the mother and vice versa. It's symbiotic. Without the creation, there is no Creator. And without the Creator, there is no creation. In order to fully understand how and why the church intentionally made the words God and Creator synonymous, why the word God as we know it today was very different in ancient times, and why all of this is important to our understanding of how much the church has devolved the way we see reality, we must first begin by looking at these two words from a grammatical perspective. The word creator is a deverbal noun, which is a noun derived directly from a verb. For example, if you create, you are a creator. If you teach, you are a teacher. And if you run, you are a runner. These usually refer to agents, which are people or things that perform the action. And they often end in ER, OR, ANT, or IST. For example, Creator is OR. Runner is ER. A participant, one who participates, that would be your ANT. And a pianist, one who plays the piano, would be an example of the IST form. The word God is not a deverbal noun because it's not derived from a verb like create or teach. Instead, it's a root noun, meaning it didn't evolve directly from a verb the way creator comes from create. Here's a quick breakdown. God with a capital G is a proper noun, and in this form, it refers to a specific deity. For example, the God of Abrahamic religions. When you see God spelt with a lowercase g, it is a common noun and it refers to any deity in general. For example, any kind of Greek god like the god Mars. God is a root noun. It's not derived from any known verb. Its origins are linguistic and cultural, not grammatical. Now, the modern etymology of the proper noun form of the word God comes from the Old English lowercase God, which traces back to Proto-Germanic Gudan and even further to Proto-Indo-European roots. So that's very interesting that God with a capital G as a proper noun is a new thing. In the original form of God, it was always spelt with a lowercase g, and you will see why later in the video, but I'll just go ahead and tell you briefly right now. The reason is because all of the ancients never saw God as a creator deity, and the creator deity would be the highest form of power in the universe above all gods, and that would be your capital God. When the word God first appeared in the human lexicon, it appeared as a word that we always spelt with a lowercase g, because this was a way to show that all gods were deities that exist in the lower realm. So just like we look at gods, Mercury, and all of the other gods on the Greek pantheon as sort of demigods that all represent certain attributes of nature like war or communication and etc. Neither of these gods is the creator. The concept of God as the creator is a new thing that only came along with the rise of Abrahamic traditions. And that is when they started spelling the word God with a capital G, because that was when the word God started to become synonymous with the word creator. And later in the video, we will break all of this down more in depth. Right now, all we need to know is that the word God, no matter if it's in its proper noun or common noun form, it is not based on a verb like the word creator is to create. That verb doesn't exist in modern English. So now that we've looked at the modern etymology of the word God in its current form, let's explore how this word existed in ancient times. How did this concept manifest back then? In ancient times, the word God would have been closer to the word guide. This is why the modern word God is not a deverbal noun. There is no verb associated with it, like how a creator creates. For example, we know how a creator creates, but we don't know how a God gods. So what is the action behind the word God? There is no verb associated with it because the church concealed the verb that would have been linked to the word God in its ancient form. It would have been closer to the word guide, which would make it a deverbal noun because a guide is one who guides. This is literally what a God is. Even in the religious sense, it is a being that leads or guides. This is crucial because to the ancient world, the concept of a God was more about something or someone that guides a person. Our consciousness, our mind, for example, is one of the most primary things that guide us. And even the Bible says, as a person thinks, so is he. So a person's God can be anything they immerse their thoughts in every day. That is what will guide them. For example, a person's God could be money if that's the primary thing on their mind every day. It could be many things. Sex, for example. Whatever drives or guides you becomes your God. This is important to note because gods or guides were never creators in the way that the church has defined them today. Another way to look at this is to think of the world as a stage. The creator is the one who built the stage, while the God is the one who attempts to control how the puppets move on it or tries to guide the puppet's behavior. In antiquity, the creator was simply an entity that created the creation. It did not interfere with anyone's behavior or affairs within the creation. Each individual had their own sovereignty to act out and to manifest whatever reality they wished within the creation. The creator's role was solely to create the creation. When the church gave the role of creator to specific gods, they forced those gods to become entities that simply sat in the sky doing nothing but overseeing the creation. They did not interfere with the creation because the original concept of the creator was one that only created the creation. The creator didn't interfere or tell people what to do in ancient times. We can see proof of this in the early church because when the church adopted this concept of the creator and attributed it to certain gods, you'll notice that there was a time, especially in early theological traditions and the philosophical influences on Christianity, when God was viewed more as a distant, non-intervening spirit or force rather than a personal, involved deity. The idea of a distant, non-intervening God did pose a major problem for the institutional church, especially when it came to control, obedience, and social order. This tension led to a critical transition in how God was presented, shifting from a remote cosmic force to a personal, watchful authority figure. Here's a breakdown of how and why this transition happened. When the church adopted these creator attributes for their specific gods, they effectively shot themselves in the foot by binding their gods to the act of creation. In the ancient world, the act of the creator was simply to create and watch over everything without interference. However, the church needed a force or entity that would intervene as it wanted to control behavior. So the church had to find a new action to attribute to their God beyond just creation and the creator role. This led to the emergence of modern forms of God, such as Jesus Christ and so on. The church then created new verbs or actions associated with their new forms of God, such as Redeemer and Savior. This was necessary because in order to control behavior, they had to threaten people with something, namely hell or eternal damnation. Then they needed to offer something to save people from that quote unquote boogeyman. And that became the figure of the Savior. So these new forms of God were now associated with new actions and verbs. They became saviors and redeemers, and the focus shifted to saving mankind's soul by encouraging obedience to laws and commands. So when the church promoted God to the creator, the two words then started to be used interchangeably. But the problem with that, like we stated, is that God as a creator has to be a distant God, and a distant God equals low social control. So in other words, when God is viewed as a remote spirit, unconcerned with daily life, or not watching or intervening in human affairs, it becomes much harder for religious leaders to motivate obedience, instill fear of consequences, or enforce social codes. A distant deity doesn't reward, punish, or even care, so why obey? This was the issue in the early church, the moment they promoted God to creator status. So once they separated God from creation as this creator force outside of the creation, sort of guarding over everything, they then had to recreate new forms of God capable of dwelling on earth with men. And this became your concepts of the messiahs, the saviors, the various holy spirits or great spirits that we see at the foundation of most Abrahamic religions. These quote unquote messiahs would also be spokesmen that would come onto the earth and deliver the message that the creator has for the creation. So the church needed a moral authority. As Christianity evolved from sort of a mystical sect into a state-supported institution, especially after Constantine in the 4th century, it needed a system of control. And what the early church knew was that you can't govern the masses with a God who's quote unquote too holy to get involved. So the church began reshaping God into someone who cares deeply about sin, watches you constantly, will judge or reward you, and delegates authority to the church itself. And so this, in a nutshell, explains how the papacy gets its power directly from God, which is a belief system of a humanized personality above the earth that is watching over everything, but it won't intervene directly. It would only do it through the quote unquote redeemers or saviors. So this explains the role of Jesus in this shift. Jesus became the bridge between the distant God and human life. Through him, God became personal, relatable, and emotional. He could now feel pain, forgive, and punish. The church taught that Jesus equaled God. So suddenly God was watching and suffering for you too. This made it easier to guilt people into obedience, justify church power as God's will, and create fear of eternal damnation or loss of salvation. So, how this elevated the role of the church in society is that the church went from some mystery group to a social authority that is now micromanaging society. So what started as a mysterious cosmic force turned into a surveillance God watching every thought and deed, a lawgiver and judge concerned with every aspect of behavior, and a divine parent figure rewarding loyalty and punishing rebellion. And what this allowed the church to do was to build systems like confession, penance, and excommunication, create moral codes, canon law, and social rules enforced by quote unquote God. It also allowed the church to justify control over kings, wars, marriages, money, sex, and etc. So just to summarize this transition, during the phase of early mystical / Gnostic interpretations of reality, God's role was distant, unknowable, and cosmic. But the challenge of the church during this phase was that it was hard to control behavior. So what was the church's response? To recreate a new form of God, place emphasis on God serving as a guide to steer the behavior of the masses. So now we're seeing now why the word God is related to the word guide, because of everything we just read. The church literally created gods to guide people's behavior and to control minds. But the problem they had was that they attributed the role of creator to God, which is why they had to respond with sending Christ or recreating God in the flesh. And God in the flesh would emphasize a certain lifestyle that the church wanted the masses to embody. For example, during the phase of Platonic Christianity, God's role was abstract, perfect, and impersonal. But the challenge was that people didn't have a fear of judgment because of this. And the church responded by mediating with Christ. During the post Constantine phase of the church, God's role was now becoming a judge, a lawgiver, and a king. And this was because the challenge of the church was that the church needed a stronger way to maintain order and obedience. So, in a nutshell, during this phase, the church basically made God personal, active, and a sort of a moral enforcer. And during the phase of medieval Catholicism, God's role was watchful, emotional, and wrathful. It was a challenge to control the masses morally and politically. So during this time, the church responded with sacraments, hell, confession. And in this time, we start to see spiritual hierarchy, archangels, chief demons. We start to see concepts like this come into Christianity. So let's do a little recap. The word God in its modern etymology has no verb associated with it. But if you look at the purpose of these gods, they were created by the church to guide behavior. They took away the original verb associated with these gods, which were entities that guided behavior. We can still see signs of this truth with titles like shepherd, master, lawgiver, and etc. These gods were essentially created to steer behavior, but instead of the church openly saying that, they presented these gods as saviors just trying to save you. The original verb associated with the word God was guide. People don't realize that today, but you can see that guiding behavior was the original purpose because, after all, what do gods do? They guide behavior. When the church went on crusades and expanded to become the worldwide entity we know today, it created different guides for different continents and regions, all designed to steer behavior and shape everyone's mental paradigms in the same direction for the same ultimate end goal, cause, and agenda of the religious controllers of the world. In a nutshell, the word God is essentially the word guide, and the church created many different guides to control the minds and actions of the masses via mental programming that we call traditions. A lot of people may be wondering, where did the devil come into play with all of this? Well, the devil was a god in his own right. He was the god over evil, just as there were gods over good. You also had gods over different vices or addictions. Today, we just call them demons. And we say that you have a sex demon or an alcohol demon. But what we're really saying is that you have an imbalance in your sexuality or in your alcohol consumption, and that this imbalance is a demon, addiction, or form of overindulgence so prevalent in your life that you are no longer in control. The sacred geometrical syncretism associated with the word God points to the word guide. What I mean by sacred geometrical syncretism is that if you look at the image of God, which is portrayed in a lot of early Christian artwork, you will see that God is just a personification of the mind. The modern origin of the word God traces back to the Proto-Germanic Gudan and further to the Proto-Indo-European Guto, meaning that which is invoked or called upon. This is important because if the word originally meant the invoked one, then God cannot be the creator, since God had to be invoked or called upon by a higher power. This distinction can be seen in the relationship between God the Son, or Jesus, and God the Father, who is the creator. In order to understand the title, quote unquote, the invoked one, we first have to examine the word invoke. It is formed from two parts, and voke. The word and is self-explanatory, while voke is related to the word vocal or voice. This is why invoke means to call upon something, whether it be a higher power, a rule, or a principle, often to seek assistance, justification, or to put something into effect. All of this demonstrates that we look to gods for guidance. But the reason the word in appears in the word invoke is because it refers to an inner guide. In essence, the reason the word God is associated with invocation is that a God is an entity called upon in prayer or in a meditative state for the purpose of guidance. It is the inner voice that either leads us or misleads us. So, how God, the creator, and all of this relates to us on a spiritual level is that the inner voice is the God or the guide, and the one who hears the voice and carries out the act is the creator. The creator only creates what it is guided to create by the God or the guide or the inner voice. We are not the voice in our heads. Rather, we are the ears listening to the conversation and acting out what we choose. The good guides within us try to encourage us to do good, and the evil guides within us try to encourage us to do bad. This concept is represented in modern time by an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other shoulder. The angel is the voice of good, which is linked to the right brain, which is why the word right is also related to righteousness or being good morally. So the angel on the right shoulder represent the right brain, which is intuition, which looks beyond itself to see what's best for the whole. And it thinks of doing the right thing. And that's the part of us that's always thinking about cosmic karma. Whereas the devil on the left shoulder represent the instinctive left brain, which is wired for survival, the body, and it tends to think selfishly, and it's programmed with fight or flight response. So the angel is the intuition of the right brain, which is the voice of righteousness that's always encouraging us to do what's best on a spiritual level. And the devil is the voice of evil, which is always encouraging us, man, I gotta eat, I gotta feed my family, I had to do what I had to do. The survival part of us that is gonna make the best decision that makes sense in the rat race from a survival perspective, where we tend to only think for ourselves. This is where our capitalistic spirit kicks in at. But it's important to realize that when we're talking about these polarizing voices that's encouraging good or bad behavior, that according to the ancestors, we are not the voices in our heads doing the encouraging. We are the listener, the creator, who chooses which voice or guide to obey at any given moment when confronted with a choice. So all of this knowledge was used by the church to gain access to humanity's control center through religious programming. Religious programming silences the real true guide or God who knew you before you were born and replaces it with a false inner voice. This false so-called inner voice does not originate from within you at all. Rather, it originates from outside of you, from the synagogues of Satan that indoctrinate us from birth for the purpose of making us obedient and too mentally inferior to ever rise up collectively against the shapers of thought disguised as world authorities. From 500 BCE to 100 CE, the word God was also referred to as Gudan, which was a common term for deity. Some may think what I'm about to say next is a stretch, but just consider this. The word deity sounds a lot like the word diet, and a diet is a way of life or a regimen, and a deity personifies a way of life or a regimen. Not only that, Ancient people often followed diets and ways of life that were prescribed to them by their deities. So we can see a syncretistic connection between these two words. They say you are what you eat, and as a man thinketh, so is he. Well, the realm of thought is a form of consumption as well, meaning that what you put into your mind is a form of consumption too. You are what you eat on all levels. That which guides you creates your mental diet, which then shapes your physical diet. God is guide and deity is diet. Both represent a way of life or a daily regimen, a pattern of behaviors that will ultimately dictate how and when you die. This is why it's fascinating that the first three letters of diet spell die. When it comes to the evolution of the words God and creator and the history of how they became synonymous with each other, we can see that there was a transition period to get us to the point where we are today, where God and creator are used interchangeably. God is not necessarily synonymous with the creator. And the idea of them being the same is a relatively new concept, one that we mainly see in Abrahamic religions, not in all belief systems around the world. The Abrahamic religions make up the hugest percentage of religions that use the words God and creator interchangeably. In Abrahamic religions like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, God is both the supreme being and the creator of all things. In this view, God is by definition the creator. In other traditions, the creator is not the highest deity, and I will give you a few examples. In some cultures, the title of creator doesn't necessarily mean the creator of the universe. For example, in Gnosticism, the demiurge is the creator of the material world, but the true God is beyond the material world and sits up on a higher plane. So remember that the act of creating will give you that title of the creator. But the question is, what did you create? And the demiurge was responsible for creating the quote unquote matrix or the simulation, whereas the true God resides in the highest heaven, aka the base reality, the realm of truth. And in Hinduism, Brahma is the creator, but Brahman is the ultimate reality. Brahma can die, Brahman cannot. So this is like the body and the soul's relationship told by the Hindu in the form of Brahma and Brahman. In certain Egyptian myths, different gods had roles in creation. Atum, Ptah, Num, but they are not all quote unquote God in a monotheistic sense. Philosophically, creator is a role, God is a nature or being. One could argue a being might be called God because of its omnipotence, transcendence, or moral authority, even if it didn't create everything. Conversely, a being could create the universe and not be God in the full religious sense. For example, it can be just a powerful architect or an advanced intelligence. And this is because in a lot of ancient cultures, the universe itself is not considered the base reality or the ultimate reality. So the thing that creates the universe or the earth is like the thing that creates the multiverse, the endless maze of parallel realities to trap the soul, the simulation, the matrix, if you will, which is why this is called the demiurge. One of the titles of the demiurge is the god of repetition, because that's exactly what a multiverse full of parallel realities is. This god is known for creating quantity. And another way of looking at this is this God creates the many lies from the one truth. Now, some alternative spiritualities actually separate the two. In some New Age or esoteric views, the quote unquote source or the quote unquote all is beyond personhood. while creators might be intermediaries, archons, or demiurges. So, in summary, God does not equal the creator by default. They often overlap in monotheistic religions, but in other systems, the creator may be a lesser being, one of many gods, or even a deceiver or jailer of souls in some Gnostic or esoteric traditions. Now, if you've noticed the upgrade in quality, you're right. I'm giving the channel a full facelift and starting by refurbishing some of my older content, just like this video. In fact, this was originally my very first upload onto YouTube. And if you want to see my original version of this concept, the link to that video is in the description area. The quality back then was rough, but hey, we all start from somewhere. So moving forward, I'll be revisiting old topics and reworking old videos into new and improved versions like this one. The older, low quality uploads aren't gone. I'm just unlisting them and moving them to a playlist called Classic Throwbacks. And the link to that playlist will be in the video description area as well. Make sure to follow that playlist because I'll be re-uploading some of the old classics that were removed from the channel over the years. Last but not least, I ask that all of you like, share, and subscribe, and drop a comment below. Let me know your thoughts on this video and what you think about the way we've been programmed to see God and the Creator as synonymous. How much does this small shift in understanding keep us disconnected from the forces and mechanisms that shape our reality?